Well, good morning, everyone. My name's Catherine Arndt and I'm the CEO of the Victorian Local Governance Association, and I would like to welcome all of you here today to one of three, or the first of three, live panel discussions supporting the VLGA's Your Community, Country and Council program, which with a small amount of funding from the state government really is the beginning of a conversation, the beginning of a process where we're looking at supporting Aboriginal candidacy, but also participation in local democracy, so in local government elections. And I'm very pleased to welcome Charles Pakana, who is leading this project on behalf of the VLGA, and I will hand over to him now to kick us off.
I'll start off now by just acknowledging that I am on Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung country, but to ensure that the VLGA and everybody here, I'm sure, we pay our respects to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples right across Victoria. And of course, the millennia-long connection to land, waters and law, culture. And we pay our respects to elders past, present, and all who have endured so much, yet remain so strong. I also like to point out that our sovereignty has never been ceded on the countries right across this. And just to point out that I believe it is this month that in 17, and I'm sorry, I've forgotten the year, that Captain Cook actually planted a flag on Possession Island and claimed sovereignty illegally, as far as I know everybody here is concerned. But I thank everybody for coming in today. It's very exciting to be involved in this project. As Catherine said, my name is Charles Pakana. I'm an Aboriginal man of Tasmanian descent, but I call, and I've been very fortunate to call Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung land my home, and having, of course, met many times with our elders, I feel very welcome here and carry the responsibility of being on this country very seriously, and I'm sure we all do. I am an independent journalist. I've worked at 3KND. I currently also freelance with Koori Mail, and I run my own various little media things as sees fit, focusing on positive stories within the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community to try and show the rest of the community that we are here, we are strong, we are never, never going away, and that we have yet to, or we are still going to be making ourselves heard. This whole event is all about, as Catherine said, to promote Aboriginal voices, and that is in local government, which is an important part of our society. Over the course of the next 3 weeks, we'll be featuring various speakers. I'm not going to go into them all right now, but our first speaker today is I'm very fortunate to have met this man several months ago, Steve Cooper, who is, apart from being a very likeable and affable fellow, is highly skilled and knowledgeable when it comes to governance and the way local government works. So I'll be moderating the event. I'm going to be handing over to Steve right now, who has a great deal of knowledge on local government. Steve, if you can start by introducing yourself, some of your background, and some of the realities that our mob needs to understand.
Thanks, Charles. If I can echo your sentiments as well, I've picked out a virtual backdrop today, which is a photo from my hometown on Wamba country. It's a piece of water that the Wamba people would know as Panamili, and I'm happy to be corrected on my pronunciation of that, but my research says means Little River. In that sense, I'm also on the land of the Wurundjeri people, and I acknowledge the traditional owners of country across the nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Charles, thanks for the intro. And it's been a pleasure working with you. Just by way of background, I suppose, in response to your initial question, how do I get to sit here in front of you folk and talk about local government? I started at my local council, the Shire of Swan Hill, when I was 18 years old, straight from school. And I suppose I was the junior in the office. I used to do things like accounts receivable, accounts payable, payroll meant driving down to the depot and handing out little cash envelopes to the blokes, cashiering, workers' compensation, that sort of office admin kind of stuff. I've subsequently worked across local government in a governance role at Box Hill or Whitehorse Council, at Port Phillip Council in a range of roles, including council planning, contract management, and managing all of the enforcement functions, so local laws and parking. Hobsons Bay Council, and for the last 6 years, I've worked in governance and ethics in state and local government, including a lot of work recently with the VLGA. You asked that I give just a bit of a background as to what sort of topics we'll unpack today. And I suppose one of the really important things, as a lot of people will know, is that as it stands at the moment, there are council elections slated for the 24th of October. And that's to say that the former minister has decreed that there will be postal voting. So that's a change under a new local government act that we've got. Formerly, councils chose their own method of voting. The current minister and the VEC to date are saying that it's safe to conduct the election. So unless we hear otherwise, we would expect the election to be conducted on the 24th of October. And that all has to happen inside a legislative framework. So one of the things that I say about councils is you can't make it up. Everything that councils do has to have a head of power somewhere, and there has to be authority to act. So predominantly we talk about the Local Government Act, but there are some other pieces of legislation as well. And the elections will be conducted in accordance with that act and those regulations if they take place, if or when they take place. Most of you will be aware that councillors, once elected, it's a 4-year term. And I think if you spoke to people who are currently on council, and I'm not sure we've got too many now, that's a long time. There's a lot of councillors who are getting pretty tired by now. We're getting to the end of a long 4 years. The way I kind of split it up is that the first year is about induction. It's about the council formulating its 4-year plan for the upcoming years. So even though the elections are 2020, the council needs to move fairly quickly and prepare a council plan, a 4-year strategic document for 21 to 25 years. And that's a really important piece of work. Charles, I suspect we might talk about that a bit more. So second and third years, really, they're the implementation of the issues that are in the plan, the key strategic areas. They're about development of policy. They're about kicking off design work. They're about reshaping the organisation to make sure it can deliver on that plan. And I call the fourth year the year of wrapping up. It's the year where typically at this time the cycle, we'd have buildings being opened and plaques unveiled and things like that as the life of the current council comes to a conclusion. Before the election, the council moves into what they call the election period, but you might know it as caretaker, to make sure that the resources of the organisation aren't used in association with the election. When we do workshops around councils, I ask people to, and you don't have to do it today, but to think of the kind of services that councils run. And we just do a bit of a Q&A on it. But the point I sort of wanted to make there is that councils are complex organisations if you think of the many and varied roles that they have. So, for example, think of a council that might, as well as actually providing governance support and running the council, would provide maintenance of a huge book of assets. So, for example, a council like the City of Melbourne has something in the order of $4.5 billion of assets on its fixed assets on its books. Even the smallest council, which is Queenscliff, has a book of assets of something in the order of $200 million or close to. And so whilst the budgets might only be a proportion of that, so Queenscliff has a budget of about $15 million annually, there is a huge role for councils of making sure that that book of assets is actually delivering on services that are consistent with the council plan and consistent with enhancing the lifestyles of the local community. And they can be things like making sure that we've got, plant and mowers that work and all of that sort of thing. that buildings are best used, and also that roads and footpaths and drains are maintained so they don't fail, you know, because no one would notice if the drain didn't work until it fails. So they're very complex organisations. Moving through that, you have a range of human services that typically start with maternal and child health kind of services. Councils have historically also delivered youth services right through to home care type services. Now there's a bit of a change with my aged care, but some councils have stayed in those services because of an absence of confidence in the private sector to deliver. And as we've seen recently, we're talking about services that help our most vulnerable people stay in their homes. Really valuable. Moving back, actually, sorry, I should go on. Councils provide recreation services, arts and events, festivals, support sporting clubs, town planning services. So, you know, some of you might have been involved where someone's been required to get a planning permit for a particular land use. Engineering services to maintain those assets. So a really diverse range of services with great pressure on budgets. Often what's not understood is the distinction between the role of councillors and the role of the CEO and council staff. So if I was putting it quickly, going back to that council plan document, Charles, the councillors set the council plan. They set the direction of the organisation, the strategy of the organisation. And when councillors make decisions, it's then the function of the Chief Executive Officer and the officers to deliver on those decisions. So if we go back to a sort of Westminster system, there is a separation between the Chief Executive and the administration and the councillors. So historically, the role of the Chief Executive and his or her staff is to provide recommendations to the council, whose decision-making power comes from a legally constituted meeting. So councillors don't have independent power to make decisions or give instruction to council staff. Their power comes from being in a meeting. And then the council makes recommendations, the CEO and staff administer those decisions. And it's really important, we can talk about failures of governance where that kind of diversion doesn't work, but I would just point quickly to the fact there are 3 councils who won't be holding elections this year in any event because those councils have been sacked by the minister because of a failure of governance. And it's really important that people be alert to the kind of issues that can give rise to that failure of governance. So the CEO supports the council, provides advice to the council, runs the organisation, if you like. The councillors do policy and strategy. That's a nice clean distinction, but there is always a bit of a diversion where politics meets policy, if you like. And that's where things can get difficult. Council meetings have to be publicly advertised. So all of your councils would do a schedule of when they're going to hold their meetings, and that should be available on their website. And in a non-COVID environment, it's really important that decisions of the council, unless they're touching on issues that they're allowed to be confidential, need to be open to the public. So transparency is important. You should not only know what the decisions of the council are, but you actually should know also how did the council arrive at that decision. And we're back to the transparency of officer reports. And I suppose in one sense, with COVID, it's never been easier to go to council meetings because there was an amendment to the Act and councils are now allowed to hold their meetings, or for several months have been allowed to hold their meetings remotely. So you can log in via Zoom and watch your council meeting from the comfort of home. The other thing it's probably worth knowing too is that in all of the Acts of Parliament, typically Victorian Acts of Parliament, there's hundreds, if not thousands, of references to the council. Remember, I started by saying that everything the council does has to have a power, like there has to be a head of power. But if every decision that the council was able to make under a piece of legislation went to the council chamber, you'd never get work done. So what's really important is that in your councils, the governance team will be holding a book signed by the CEO and possibly the Mayor, depending on the Act, of delegations of power, of things under an Act of Parliament that have been delegated through the council or the CEO to members of staff in line with their sort of position in the organisation. So say, for example, the common one I use to explain it simply, say, for example, you own a property, you've got a big backyard and you want to build a shed that's too big, that's bigger than the planning scheme will allow. And you put up the notice at the front of your house and none of your neighbours object, then it's likely that a junior planning officer would be able to issue your permit under a delegation. It wouldn't have to go to the council. And there are a myriad of decisions like that that are just dealt with by those organisations every day. So it sounds all quite simple, but as I just touched on along the way, sometimes politics gets mixed up with good policy, and it's, whilst in one sense it's quite alluring, I don't know about fun, I wouldn't call that the word, but it has a way of, the politics and the conflict have a way of drawing people in. Well-run organisations come back to a policy framework, and that's a really important way to operate. Charles, that's probably all I've got by way of an introduction, and I see there's been a few questions, though I haven't read them yet, and I'm happy to be guided by you.
And we'll get to those. A couple of the things that I would like to go over just quickly though, Steve, before we get on to the questions, and I feel that they're really, we've got a pretty cool audience here because we're going to be bombarded with these. But a couple of questions that I would like to see or hear covered in this is just a clear understanding for people about what's really required of a councillor. It's not just attending the occasional meetings. There's a heck of a lot of work involved and a lot of hours that some councillors, newly minted councillors, discover, much to their surprise, a little bit too late. So, thumbnail dipped in tar, a quick sketch of the responsibility of a new councillor, mate.
Yeah, sure. Look, the first one, in fact, it's always interesting, and if you went back some years, the responsibility of an individual councillor, the Act was silent, and it's only a fairly recent inclusion in the Act, and it talks at a fairly high level about the responsibility of a councillor to just participate in meetings. So, and that doesn't sound like a lot because it's basically saying go to meetings, be present, vote. But we know that anyone that's been on council probably spends anything from 3 to 5 or 6 hours over the weekend just reading business papers. Some councils have agendas that run to 700-800 pages, like they can be very long-winded documents. So that preparation is really important. Most councils would meet at least weekly, either council meetings, councillor briefings, committees, and then, you know, councillors need to be involved in advisory committees, so public consultations through structured committees that provide advice on particular topics. Some councils, you know, there are also basically community groups and meeting with members of the community, managing your social media, doing your own PD. What we would suggest is it's a 20 to 30 hour job per week. I know some councillors that would put a number of more like 40 or 50 hours on it, Charles. So there's a lot of time there. There's also a bunch falling out of that issue around participation of meetings. There's a bunch of other responsibilities that you would go into in terms of either conduct, or there's some obligations on councillors in terms of how they make decisions and what they bring to the meeting.
And I am aware, just on that, that it was one of the contributing factors to at least one of those councillors that the ex-minister Adam Somyurek used in dismissing at least one of those councils, was just councillors not attending meetings month after month. So no names, no pack drills though.
And perhaps that's a good segue into the question that Matt had, which was around the governance responsibilities of councillors. So Steve, would you like to touch on that?
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. And a lot of these things go with the office, and I'll come back to that point if I need to. But and you could look at that question in the sense of, what does the Act say? And then what were the failures at some of those councils? The Act has that responsibility, like some important responsibilities in terms for councillors of, for a start, coming to the meeting and representing the whole community. What's really important for councillors is that, remember I said there's 100 different services. And public policy is hard. Public policy involves choices. Public policy often involves competing groups. Finding a way through public policy where the best outcome is produced can be difficult. But what that does rely on is, and it can be really challenging for people coming onto the council from an advocacy position, as to how you then take that councillor role and consider the whole community without losing sight of the advocacy role that your constituency might have given, elected you on. So there's some balancing around that. There's some responsibilities around, and interestingly, increasing responsibilities around respect. Respect for the office of council, respect for the decisions that are made. And that's to say that sometimes individual councillors don't get their way. The vote goes in a different direction. I'm aware of a mayor at one council that I worked at, I was Port Phillip, a very, very, very high profile planning decision went in a way that mayor didn't support. In fact, I know that after the meeting, that mayor was emotionally devastated by that decision. But she had the responsibility the next day of fronting up on John Fane's radio program and defending the decision of the council, a decision that she didn't personally agree with. And that goes to the integrity of that person who honoured the institution, even though the decision that was made was deeply hurtful of us. And that's a requirement of the Act, to respect the council and its decision-making processes. And the other one is probably around a respect for others. There's a requirement under the Local Government Act, and we can dig a bit deeper, Charles and Catherine, if you like, in terms of code of conduct, but fundamentally being on the council is a workplace, and it does require respect for other councillors who you don't agree with, the council staff who might make recommendations that you don't like. Sometimes CEOs have to give you advice that you don't necessarily want to receive, but that's their job. And respect for the community, because sometimes members of community will have views that are quite different to yours. That said, and I always make the comment, there is a line on that point, that no one, to put it bluntly, no one is in public office to be a punching bag. No one is in public office to be vilified or threatened, and it's really important. And that goes to, in some ways, the way that the council conducts its business sets the tone for the organisation and for the community to be respectful.
Did you want to also touch on that? Because when it comes to governance, there is always the issue of conflicts of interest. And I know that you and I have talked extensively about this, but I think it might be appropriate at this time, before we go on to the next question, and also check with Matt that his question has been appropriately answered, and we'll come to on that one, brother. But just the two types of conflicts of interest, and what are some of the repercussions if they're broken?
Sure, and quick note to Matt and the other listeners, I'm not looking at the chat because I don't multitask particularly well, so I'm sort of focusing on the question. So if I don't answer it, please come back round again. Happy to try, do my best to give you the best answer I can. Managing conflicts of interest is really important, and to emphasise how easy it is to be blindsided, and it goes back a way, but I don't think anything's changed. In 2014, the Ombudsman of the day did a report to the Parliament on conflicts of interest in local and state government. And in that report, the Ombudsman said that every time that organisation goes to a council or to a government department to do an investigation, they find conflicts of interest unmanaged. And that's to say that it's too easy for people to be blindsided because they'll rationalise that it's not important, or that the decision didn't go someone's way, or everyone else does it, so there's no reason why I shouldn't, and rationalises a failure to declare conflicts of interest. So what's a conflict of interest? It's basically where, in actuality or a perception, that your personal interest is overriding your public interest in making of decisions. Is it a bad thing to have a conflict of interest? No, we've all got conflicts of interest. We're all related to people. We've got friends. We've been members of organisations. We've worked for people. And I know some people have heard me say this in another forum. I was in a meeting once and a former Premier actually made the comment, if you go through your life without a conflict of interest, you're spending too much time in your lounge room. you will have conflicts of interest. It's entirely normal. What's really important, though, is that the conflict is recognised, put out on the table, and particularly if you stay in, that there's a logic given as to why you don't believe it should cause you to remove yourself from the meeting, although the chances are, if you've had to raise it, the general rule is if in doubt, get out. So what's a conflict of interest? The Local Government Act in some ways has been simplified, but in other ways has been made more difficult. There's two sorts. One is called a material conflict of interest, and that's where the interests of you, your family, your friends will be impacted in a way that can be measured financially, either upwards or downwards, positive or negative, on the basis of a decision that you make. So it might be about a land use decision affecting the value of a property. It might be about a grant to an organisation. It could be about the award of a contract to someone known to you. The rule is, and oftentimes in councils, affects more officers than councillors in terms of contracts. But if you become aware of the fact that a contract tenderer might be a friend or a relation, you can't participate because there's a conflict of interest. The other sort of conflict, Charles, is a bit more difficult, and I'm still wrestling with it myself, I've got to say, and that's like a general or indirect conflict. You might also think of it as a perception of a conflict where, this is a bit legalistic, and I'm not a lawyer, I should say, where a reasonable person might think there's a reasonable chance that your decision might be influenced by the relationship you've got. That will be very much a case-by-case basis, but a really classic example would be, you know, if you're on the board or you've been on the board of an organisation that is applying for a grant, chances are a reasonable person would say, well, you're influenced by that. If you're on the council, and this is only my opinion, I'm saying on a case-by-case, check it, but the distinction would be if you're on a council and you're considering a policy that affects part of your constituency, you'd want to explore it, but there's a chance that your interest is the same as everyone else. You're only considering the policy because you want to do the best for that community, and it's well-spirited and there's no direct financial. So maybe there's a line there that says you would stay in. Even if you stayed in, I think that, and all the advice I've heard is it's very prudent to put on the public record the reasons why you think there's not a conflict and to get good advice.
Thanks for that. Now, Matt, has your question or the purpose or the intent of your question been addressed, mate, or do we need to head into another area?
I think so. I mean, I suppose it really comes down to doing the right thing. But that being said, how often does that happen? And it's very fluid, so it's open for interpretation, isn't it? A little bit like common sense, I suppose. So.
Yeah.
Actually, that's really interesting, Matt, that you said it's open for interpretation. Steve, when you and I have talked about this before, you have made mention of the fact that there are people within council who can assist councillors up front determining whether something they're going to be involved in represents a conflict of interest. Can you just touch on that briefly, please, mate?
Yeah, and I'm not sure how helpful I'll be here, Matt, but absolutely, it's the role of the council staff, the CEO and the council staff to support councillors. So if a councillor has a concern about, am I treading on dangerous ground with conflicts of interest, certainly it's the role of the CEO and the governance team to give you the best advice that they can in terms of what does the legislation say, what are the case studies that we know of. But the reality is that ultimately the decision has to come back to the individual. That said, the council staff can't help, just quietly, you can often read the tea leaves. You know, it's your decision, councillor, but be alert too, X, Y, and Z can be code for, you know, if it was me, I wouldn't be staying in there. But it has to sit with the councillor.
Just to check on that to make sure I'm at least clear on that. So whilst a councillor can't just willy-nilly go and speak to any council employee, they can obviously go to the CEO for guidance and to, let's say, the governance. Is that fair?
Actually, we've segued accidentally into a really important topic, Charles. Thank you for that. One of the CEO's responsibilities, and this falls out of some failures of governance at other councils, is to develop the protocols for communication between the councillors and council staff. And that's because councillors clearly can't direct council staff, but certainly need to interact with the council staff. In most organisations, what that means is that the CEO, the members of the executive team, presumably they're executive assistants, they are the go-to people for councillors. It's important that councillors not go fishing around the organisation for the answer that they want. But in that quite simple description there, at most reasonable sized councils, the governance manager and perhaps the comms manager would also be go-to people for the council, but it has to be done in the framework of that document, which is usually called a councillor staff interaction protocol or something like that. So there'll be a well-worn trail to the sources of information that you need.
Thanks for that, Steve. The next question we've got actually comes from Tamsin. I'm really excited to get this particular question because it's something that's always bugged me, and it deals with the transparency of government. And I think, Tamsin, that's what you're after. Yeah, I see the nodding in the background. And the question is that, or the statement around that was that at my council there was a closed meeting, I assume a closed council meeting, regarding the shooting of kangaroos that obviously raised a great deal of concern within the community. Resulted that 3 tourism businesses had to close. And the question is, could the community have requested permission to attend the meeting? And when is it permitted for a meeting to be closed and to exclude the local community? In other words, when is it sort of just closed business and when is the community invited? Because it does seem arbitrary at times. And it's not good.
Thanks for the question, Tamsin. I should say I do feel a little bit ill on that particular topic, and I'll sort of go through why in a moment. The overarching principle in the Local Government Act is that meetings are to be open to the public. So as a default position, meetings should be open to the public. Both the 1989 Act and the new 2020 Act, though, also acknowledge that sometimes there's not a public interest in meetings being open to the public. I haven't finished the answer yet, though, Tamsin. Hang on. And those reasons have been clarified. Look, I haven't got the current Act with me, and so the wording slightly eludes me. It's worth looking at the change. The 89 Act talked about things that you would absolutely expect. If the council's receiving legal advice, where you want to retain the privilege of the legal advice. If the decision could impact adversely on any member of the community. In fact, I know there's a new change in terms of, think about sometimes the council might be considering issues that if the information got out, someone could make a great gain on speculation on property or a particular contract. So there are, and I'll make that point because there are some things where there is absolutely a public interest in the meeting being behind closed doors, but there has been discussion at times on that topic where it's sort of said to be a bit pejorative. Councils are getting better at having issues discussed in public more than they did. So there has been a real push, and I'll talk to why now. In 2015, I think, the Ombudsman did a report on transparency in local government and did a rather famous within the sector kind of league table. And interestingly, at one end found Hobson's Bay to be the most transparent council because they had the lowest proportion of confidential items of all of their decisions. Now, I'm not sure that's a great measure, but that sounds fine. The other interesting thing was that the least transparent council happened to be Casey Council. And at the time I thought, oh, that's a bit harsh. Maybe they've got a lot of contracts. But in fact, maybe the Ombudsman was on the mark there. But I can't comment for sure. So that's just idle speculation. One of the criticisms of the Ombudsman in that report was that there are a number of councils that she found were declaring issues to be confidential and discussing matters behind closed doors because they would be embarrassing to the council concerned, rather than the fact that they legitimately fell in the ambit of confidentiality. And there was a bit of a catch-all clause, that one about that would prejudice any individual, or some words to that effect. There was a very broad interpretation of that. The council is required to, so my best recollection on that topic is that the definitions have been tightened, and there is a real sense, you know, particularly with the adoption of a public transparency guideline, that councils make greater efforts to consider those matters in public. And all I can suggest on the particular issue is I'd be writing to the department, to the Minister and to Local Government Victoria, and the council indeed, and seeking some sort of explainer, actually start with the council, seeking some sort of explainer as what, if they can tell you, what is the trigger that would, you know, render that, confidential. It's probably the best you can do, because your avenues are a little bit unclear at the minute.
You feel that answers your question, Tamazin? Just give me a thumbs up if you like. That's fine. Okay, that's fine. A thumbs up or a thumbs down is all we need, I think, folks. That's great. Thank you so much indeed. And thanks, Steve, for that response. We have another question from Karen Douglas. And the question is, has or can remote meetings enhance participation of citizens who have otherwise been unable to participate in their local democratic processes? I love this question. And do you believe that online participation would continue? A bit of crystal ball gazing there, I think, but it's really delving into something that is bringing about a change in ordinary citizens participating in, as Karen said, the democratic process.
I'm a bit torn on this one, Karen. Thanks for the question. And this is just a personal opinion, I'd have to say. I know some particularly rural councils have been quite concerned because of internet accessibility, I suppose, for some of their population, and how they can make their remote meetings live. The intent of the amendment was to, as far as is absolutely possible, have the remote meetings replicate what would occur as if it was an open meeting. Now, that's been an interesting one because, for example, with an open meeting where there's direct attendance, people can, under certain council local laws or in regard to particular processes, can come to the meeting and address the meeting. But what that's meant in terms of remote meetings, particularly early days, was that you found people making submissions and then the CEO or staff reading those submissions to the council. I know a lot of councils have got better now at their use of Zoom technology and managing the meetings so that question times, for example, can happen with direct questions from the community, or that people can read their own statements. I think the best answer to your question is, I've always made, or for a long time, I've made a bit of a joke, and not at the people, because I actually really admire those folk who are so interested in their councils that they go along regularly to watch council meetings. And you could say that most councils have a small handful of people who come to every meeting and are really interested council watchers. Now, often that might be because they don't trust the organisation, but that's fine. Their motive's up to them. But and then what you would also have in an open meeting was a group of people who would come when the issues affect them, and then they would leave. Now, some come more than others, but, you know, by the time often you get to the fourth or fifth item on the agenda, there would just be those hardy regulars still in the gallery. What a lot of people have said to me lately is that they are getting big numbers of people logging into Zoom meetings, that's actually happening, but people can access the meeting really easily. The challenge, I think, is for the organisation to ensure it's done in a way where the individual councillors are still able to act as a cohesive team, to still be fully present in the meeting, you know, have their face up, make sure that they're focused. Whether it will continue, I'm not sure. That's a matter for government and for the sector to sort of probably needs to really formally review what has happened and what will that look like in the future. I think if I was to make one recommendation to government, would be to provide councils with more flexibility. And I know at the VLGA, Catherine and I have talked about the fact that from time to time, if there's fires, flood, natural disaster, maybe councils should have the flexibility to conduct remote meetings without going through major legislative change. And we're well set up to do that.
Karen, do you feel the question's been answered appropriately and fully? with thumbs up. Oh, we've set a precedent here. Thank you so much indeed. I want to thank Robert. You've been very, very patient, mate. You sent your question through ages ago. I told you Steve was an absolute font of information, and there's no doubt about that. Steve has requested, Robert has requested, Steve, if you could answer this question, and that is, if someone is already employed by a council, as he is, in a school crossing supervisor capacity, is this a bar to being considered to be nominated or to nominate as a council candidate?
It's one of those answers, Robert, that you know that bureaucrats are going to say it depends. The short answer to that is that as a council employee, no matter at what level, a council employee at a particular council can stand for that council. There's a quite specific requirement, though, that on lodgement of a nomination, they are required to take leave of absence, and if elected, would be required to immediately resign their position. So from the time of nomination, take leave of absence. As soon as you're elected, you have to resign the position. The penalties for a person, because otherwise you're not qualified to be a councillor, you're disqualified for being a councillor, and the penalties for acting as a councillor when disqualified are, as you can imagine, quite serious. That said, there is nothing to preclude a member of council staff standing for office at another council. So that is quite possible. I'm not aware of anyone that does it. I know someone that tried and didn't get on, but yeah, so there's nothing to stop that. I'll just mention one thing on that point, Charles, too. We'll try to provide the best general advice that we can for anyone who's interested. The VEC, the Victorian Electoral Commission, is the voice of truth on all things in relation to the conduct of elections, and it's worth going onto their website just to check for sure.
Thanks, Steve. And a quick note on that, we do have the VEC coming in. 19th of August at 10:30 on Wednesday, we actually have the VEC coming in, who'll be speaking about a range of fascinating issues. Now, Robert, I saw you give a quick thumbs up there, mate. You're okay with that? Steve, I just want to clarify one thing that you said, that just because you may be employed at one council doesn't mean you can't go and stand at another council. You do, of course, need to meet the candidacy requirements
absolutely.
Within the council. So,
yeah, that's usually a good idea, Charles. And we say at the candidate workshops that we're running, it's like it is absolutely vital that anyone thinking of standing for council really carefully checks eligibility. And I would presume a lot of people in community are aware of what happened at the City of Melbourne in the 2016 elections, where a candidate was ultimately prosecuted because they didn't have an entitlement. So please, please, please check your entitlement just to be sure.
And I'll just throw in here, because I know other people are thinking that now, Mob. Well, according to the white law, they weren't eligible, but she was a Wurundjeri woman running on Wurundjeri land. So, but we won't go there because that's
no. But I think it's absolutely appropriate that you say that. And look, sadly, Charles, it's what does the Act say? You know.
Now, I would encourage people. We've only got about another 10 minutes or so for the event. So, if you do have questions, get them into that panel there. Now, Steve, one of the other questions that you and I yarned about was single candidate or single policy candidates. A lot of people are obviously driven to enter into local government with a single issue in mind. They then discover quite rudely that they need to be across a broad range of issues that are affecting the community that has elected them. What's the reality of this?
Look, I've got to put my cards on the table, Charles. When we're getting into sort of advocacy topics, I am playing somewhat out of my lane. I've not been involved in roles where I'm doing advocacy, except as from time to time in managing communications, but not as an advocacy person. So a lot of the listeners out here will know this topic better than me. I think one of the issues around advocacy is to what extent, if your issue isn't currently a priority for the organisation, how do you move it from marginalised to mainstream? How do you make that topic part of the day-to-day decision making of the council. And in terms of those people who are the decision makers in the organisation, move their thinking from, this is a bit pejorative and I'm only saying it because I can't think of a better word, but almost tokenism, to a genuine, heartfelt integration of thinking. A really classic example would be that councils do from time to time, and for very good reason, employ specialist advocates in the organisation. So you might have a disability advocate, you might have an Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander advocate, you might have a multicultural advocate, etc. And that's all fine, except if those in the organisation then say, well, we've got that person in our organisation, they're doing that work for us. And somewhere along the line, it seems to me that it's almost like in those roles, how do people work to make the position redundant so the thinking is so good that we don't need, we've become mainstream. We're not marginalised anymore. And that's a real challenge. Now, in terms of the council chamber, you've got to get the numbers. Like, everything is about what's voted on, and there's something about how do you frame your advocacy issue in a way where the others in the group don't see that by supporting that they're giving something else up, and that it's an either or kind of a conversation. I'm probably living your lives more than mine at the moment, and I'm acutely aware of that. But the reality is that the council organisation, it votes and the majority gets up. So there's a huge influencing topic on that, around going right back to the values of the organisation and what the organisation stands for, getting real sort of ownership and buy-in in relation to an action plan, getting commitment from players as to what milestones on that plan would look like, celebrating successes, pointing out where we've fallen short. It's probably the best answer I can give, Charles, but I would really commend, in this forum and others, really unpacking how to succeed on that, because we can talk about the governance structure, what the Local Government Act says, but unless you get some movement, it's all for now.
Yeah. And we've actually got a couple of more questions that are just coming in, so we'll have to get through these fairly quickly. But Jacinta has requested that you address, how do you hold councillors accountable to a committee on which they sit, and how can they be removed? And I must admit, I thought before my time.
Ooh, Jacinta, thank you.
Thanks, Jacinta.
Wow. It's an interesting, I'd always, by first principles, go back to what are the terms of reference of the committee in a particular case. And just to explain to everyone, one of the early things once elected that the council will do is that it will appoint all of its delegates and representatives, and that will include delegates and representatives to advisory committees. And I see you nodding, Jacinta, I presume that's the process by which you're going through. Sometimes those delegates and representatives are appointed because the other councillors know that that councillor has a particular interest, so they'll pop them on that committee. And look, that might be fine, particularly if the councillor has been an advocate, but it also might be, sometimes a bit of fresh blood can be useful as well. It's also important, this is probably a bit of a bugbear of mine, is that in a really good governance model, the councillor who's chairing that committee should attend to process and, as far as possible, stay out of content, because it's not great practice for a councillor, for example, to be part of a consultation or developing the outcomes of that consultation and then sitting on the council that considers it. Now, that doesn't often happen in its best practice. As a starting point, I think it's, my starting point would be the mayor is typically the go-to. And in fact, the Local Government Act, the new act, has given the mayor a new power to to appoint chairs of delegated committees, and presumably there's an influence around advisory committees as well. The mayor is the first citizen of the council. That would be a useful kind of a go-to person, but it does fluctuate from time to time, and I'm probably not giving you a great answer unless there's something more specific to get into.
We are going to have to wrap it up right now. I'm sorry. I know there are a couple of other questions that are still here on notice. We do have other dates coming up. So in 7 days' time, 10:30, we have Shani Wellington, I believe, from NITV. She's past political correspondent there, and she'll be talking to us about social media and pitching questions or pitching stories to your local media as well, which is a very important thing to do in running for local government. I will also just point out that Joanna Skelton has put forward a lovely, thanks Joanna, a lovely offer. And she stated that she's been campaigning since March this year, and she's found it very helpful to be chatting with others who are running. And if anybody wants to reach out to her to do this, then she's provided her email address in the chat, which is very generous. And good on you. I really want to do anything I can to get First Nations voices into local government. It'll take a while, but we're certainly getting there. And just for your interest, where there are about 10 in New South Wales, at one stage there were about 20 or 30, I believe, but we only have one here in Mansfield. So we've got a long way to go. Let's show those New South Welsh people how we can do it. And respect also to you, Joanna, because you were dealing with a little one whilst all this was going on. We noticed that. We pick up everything. I do want to thank everybody very much for their input and for their respect through this.
Thank you, Charles. One of the things that I just wanted to close with, and I would like to thank you, Steve and Charles, and also for all of you today for your participation. As I said, this is the beginning of a process of conversation, and I think also we've heard a lot about councillor responsibilities and governance, and that can certainly be quite overwhelming for people who haven't really thought about running before. But I think what it should also highlight is for us as residents who have the right to vote in local government elections, that we really need to cast informed votes and participate in that opportunity at the very least. So I hope that some of what you've heard today might assist you in having a good look at those people who are running as candidates in your local community and casting a vote to make sure that we get the right people in those roles. But thank you very much for your participation today.
And respect to everyone out there. Thank you.